Thanks for joining us, folks. This is one in a series of webinars that we've been hosting here at Shing Digital. I'm going to introduce myself first. My name is Jeff Shea. I'm the moderator of our webinar today, and thank you for joining. I'm the Sales and Marketing Director at Shing Digital, and I'm very pleased to see that we've got such a great turnout today in terms of the attendees, and I think you'll find a lot of value in our content today. I'm going to be introducing our panelists in a moment, but just to refresh everybody's memory about the subject matter that we're covering today, it's to do with businesses relaunching, and certainly in terms of the timing of reopening the economy, it's kind of still being decided across the country. But whenever that decision is made, we want to make sure as business leaders and decision makers, we're making the right decisions for society at large, for our employees, for ourselves, and for our businesses. And getting that balance just right is is a difficult task. There's a lot of factors to be considered. And in today's webinar, though, I think we've got an approach that I think will be useful for you, because we're starting with a little bit of a macro perspective, and then we're going to move towards the micro, if that makes sense. In other words, we're establishing what is the landscape that we're all dealing with right now. What is the general sense of the factors we need to balance from an ethical standpoint, and also with due consideration for the medical side of things, the virus itself. And then we're going to move into, you know, where the rubber meets the road, really the on the ground decisions that our panelists are making. But one word of caution is we know that everybody's situation is somewhat different. You know, everybody's environment is different. The number of employees are different. The business that you're operating is different. Your exposure to risk factors are different depending on how public you are. So, you know, it's not that you can necessarily take everything that we're discussing that works in our environments and apply it to your situation. But I think in general, though, I think you'll come out of this webinar with a sense of confidence that, you know, the practices and procedures that you probably already had in mind, hopefully are aligned with best practices as we see it. So with that little intro, I also want to mention that a big part of this type of webinar is the interactive element, and that is we want to see some questions from you guys. So you'll see at the bottom of the screen there's a Q&A button, and please feel free to type in your questions, and if you wanted to direct them to a specific panelist, excuse me, make note of that. And we have some little gifts for you for the questions that you're able to send our way. We'll pick out some of the most appropriate, or actually pertinent questions, I should say, and we'll be sending you out some Starbucks gift cards. Also at the end, we're going to ask if you could take a look at the exit survey that will be sent your way, and give us some feedback. We definitely want to continue with these webinars, and we want to make the content relevant to you, of course. So give us some feedback, and the best exit survey will get an even bigger Starbucks card. So, and I like Starbucks, so feel free to invite me along when you're going. So that being said, let's introduce our panelists to you. Kash Wang, he's the president and CEO of Shing Digital, and he's going to share his perspectives on some of the policies and procedures that he has put into place for our particular organization. Tony Melnichuk is the director of labor and employee relations with a very large employer here in Alberta. And we have Dr. Craig Jenny. He's the PhD medical science immunology. He's with the U of C, and he's the associate professor, one of many associate professors at the U of C. And we're going to kick things off with this gentleman, who's the chair of the Department of Law and Business with the Ted Rogers School of Business at Ryerson, back east in Toronto, who's joined us. And we're going to turn it over to Professor Chris McDonald. Chris.
Thanks very much. And I'm just going to share my slides here. Here we go. And so one of the first things I'll say, just Thank you for the introduction. I should point out that though I'm chair of the Department of Law and Business, I'm actually not a lawyer, so nothing I say is legal advice. I'm actually a philosopher by training, and I specialize in business ethics. So what I'd like to do is spend a few minutes talking about ethical issues that are arising for businesses. And as Jeff said, there is no cookie cutter solution, no cookie cutter. There's no one set of issues that every business is facing. It really, really matters whether you're a chain of restaurants as opposed to a technology company. But I'm going to try and provide sort of an overview of some of the issues that businesses in general are facing right now and will continue to face as we hopefully start moving back towards normal in the coming weeks and months. So first, just one slide, real quick, sort of some starting principles, kind of a business ethics 101, just to sort of set the ground, because people often misunderstand what the perspective is when you say you're going to talk about business ethics. First is that there are no sort of strict formulas. There's no way to take an ethical issue, jam it into some kind of algorithm, and then just crank out the right solution. Wise ethical management just requires doing a lot of hard work to balance the obligations that you have to many stakeholders. Second thing to point out is that ethics is not the same as the law. Ethics and the law have a lot of overlap, and they often inspire each other, and they play some of the same role in regulating business. But ethics is not the same as the law. The fact that something is ethically, the fact that something is legally allowed doesn't mean that it's ethically permissible, and sometimes the reverse. Ethics ethics isn't just about what not to do. Sometimes we think about ethics in terms of the rules, the limits, the don'ts, the do nots, but we also want to think about ethics as being about the values that our companies embody and the things that allow us to work together to do good work. Another sort of more specific background consideration. In time of crisis, as in regular times, it's fine to pursue profits. It's okay to make money. You just got to be a little more cautious right now about how you do so. And overall, kind of the primary rule for business ethics from a practical point of view is that you need to be ready to be accountable for your decisions, right? So you need to have thought your decisions through, so that whether it's a concerned stakeholder or whether it's the CDC showing up to say, hey, why did you do that? You've got a good answer. So let me work through just a handful of topics that most, if not all, companies are facing today, keeping in mind that the way an issue is faced by, again, a restaurant or a grocery chain is going to be very different from the way it's faced by a software company or a consulting firm. So here are some big buckets. Bucket number one is kind of pricing and advertising. I think very early in this crisis, we saw some companies and individuals get some very bad press for bad behavior in this regard. Obviously, people need to be careful with pricing. It's one thing to say, well, our prices have increased because our costs of doing business have increased. If trucking costs have increased, then of course your prices are going to float with them. But just be super cautious. People are extremely sensitive about this, and rightly so. So it's fine to recoup extra costs, but generally not more. Also, I think people need to be really careful with advertising. We've seen an awful lot of advertising these days that is aimed at presenting a message of, our company is with you, we all stand together. That's fine. I think companies need to be scrupulously honest, though, about what it is that they're presenting and about what it is that they're offering. And I also think we need to be careful to avoid opportunism. So I've seen a lot of ads recently that don't make any false claims, but that are suspiciously products that I hadn't seen enter my news feed before are suddenly popping up in a way that doesn't say anything false. But if you're advertising, even cleaning products at this point, ones that that have nothing to do, have no antiviral properties, you're kind of being parasitic on people's general anxiety about cleanliness and hygiene at this point. So I think companies need to be careful about that. Workplace safety, obviously that's a huge one, and it's really going to vary a lot depending on what kind of company you are. And I think first and foremost, the rule is going to be listen to public health authorities, not just because it's the right thing to do, but also because that's what people expect of you. People expect responsible companies to listen to public health authorities and take appropriate advice. I also think companies should be thinking in terms of a division of labor approach to figuring out how to best maintain safety in the workplace. Employees, for example, know their workplace probably better than you do, right? If you're a grocery store, the guy stocking the shelves knows those shelves better than the manager does, and so you want to engage your employees to get their ideas about how they can work safely. On the other hand, employers have better access to information, to personal protective equipment, and they're the ones that have the ability to set policy. So if everybody does their part here, I think there's promise of arriving at reasonable solutions. Here's a big one for employees, and especially for a lot of us who are knowledge workers or companies who are in the sort of tech or service space, working from home. It's kind of, everybody's realizing that, well, working from home used to sound like a great thing. It's actually a lot harder than it looks, and puts a lot more strains of all kinds, including psychological strains on employees. And I think one key bit of advice I would give to companies is that you should be managing on productivity, not on time. The point isn't how many hours does an employee spend in front of their screen doing the work. The point is, do they get the job done, right? So the same way, I've got a friend who's a senior HR lawyer at a very large financial firm that I won't name. And when I asked him I said, do you monitor whether your employees are wasting time on Facebook? And this was back in regular times. And he said, nah, we don't care about that. He says, if they're not getting their work done, we know it. And that's the point. And I think that's the lesson companies need to take now. But I think you need to have slightly lower expectations on productivity, because half your employees are at home taking care of kids, and realize that a little bit of lower productivity is essentially the rent you're paying on your employees' dining tables. You've now turned, through no one's fault, you've now turned their dining room into your office. And so it's reasonable to expect that there's going to be some cost involved. Customer safety, again, a huge one. And I'll go back to this multiple times. Listen to public health authorities, right? Again, both because it's the right thing to do, they're the best source of information, but also because in the end, if something goes wrong, the question is going to be, did you listen to public health authorities? Were you getting advice where you should, or were you ignoring it? Keep in mind that you know more about the relevant risks than your customers do, even very well-informed customers, even customers who have been paying attention to those public health authorities. You're the one who knows the risk of your workplace, of your shop, and so the onus really is on you. Training. This is a huge one. I think a lot of companies are going to see that they aren't as well trained on certain issues, that their employees aren't as well trained as they maybe thought. And so I think it's time to take training seriously. On a per employee basis, Canadian companies spend significantly less on training than their American counterparts do. And you might, on the one hand, you might say, well, that's really efficient, but on the other hand, it may point to a gap in training. But training becomes especially important if you've got staff in face-to-face interaction with the public, because you're going to want to ask, are they well trained on the use of personal protective equipment? Most employees in most industries won't be. Are they well trained on social distancing? Are they well trained on cleaning? And are they well trained, and this is the hard one, in dealing with a frightened public, right? So it's the public interactions. How do I deal with a customer who isn't wearing a face mask, sneezes into their hand, and then grabs that can of beans and puts it back? It's all of that interaction that I think is going to be a real challenge for a lot of companies. And then finally, I think kind of the last topic I want to point to is the question of stepping up, right? Not just about what you should and shouldn't do, but what could you do? How are you helping? What are you doing? How can your business contribute? And it's worth pointing out that contributing here or helping doesn't mean philanthropy. It doesn't mean, are we donating money? It doesn't mean, are we giving away our product? Companies help in good times and bad just through producing products that people need. But it's time for companies, I think, to think about, when people look back on this 5 years from now, what are they going to say about us? Are they going to say, yeah, they managed to squeeze a few extra dollars out of it? Or are people going to say, yeah, that's a company that stepped up, that really did what was best for the public? Now is a time to bank goodwill that you may need later on. So in conclusion, I'd just like to say that a crisis like this really is a time for companies to ask this question: who are you? Who are we? Right? Both as a company and as individuals and as managers. What do you stand for? Right? I think a lot of companies went into this, some companies went into this knowing very well what they stood for. And so it made it relatively easy to figure out how to handle the crisis because they already knew what their values were. What are your values? Keep in mind that you are what you do, not what you say. The values that are written in on your website or on the wall of your corporate lobby, those aren't who you are. How you act is what you are. That's it for me. Thanks very much.
That's terrific. Thank you very much, Professor McDonald. That's an awesome presentation, and I'm like everybody. I'm sure I've got some great takeaways from that presentation, and I'm sure we'll get some excellent questions for you towards the end. But yeah, absolutely. We're called upon now to reevaluate our values, and we're called upon to sort through, what really matters. And, it's encouraging to see so many, both individuals and business leaders stepping up to that responsibility. And yeah, the stakes are pretty high. Thanks again. And now we're going to move on to Dr. Craig Jenny. And if you're ready, Dr. Jenny, we'll turn it over to you.
Sure. That's awfully tough presenter to follow. So I am going to take a few minutes now and discuss the virus itself, a little bit about what COVID-19 looks like in Canada, and then trying to avoid falling into the university lecture, but what is the virus? How does it work? A little bit. And then using that as a basic description of what testing looks like in Canada and where we might be going with testing, which I think most people believe is really one of the keys to safely reopening the workplace. So with that, I thought I would just start with a little timeline of COVID-19 in Canada. So we often hear this condition referred to as COVID-19, which is the name of the disease. The actual virus itself is known as SARS-CoV-2. So this tells us that it is related to the SARS virus from 2002. So it is a type of virus, a family of virus, and this is simply a new variant of that virus. The first reports of people with COVID-19 were emerging in December in Wuhan, China. So as covered in the media, the first Canadian case really didn't appear until about a month later. So about the middle of January was our first confirmed Canadian case, and that was in British Columbia. And then I thought I would just put together a quick little timeline to show you how the virus moved through the Canadian community. So our first case was on the 15th of January. By over a month later, so February 23rd, we had got into 10 cases in Canada. So it took more than a month to get us to 10 cases. In early March, we had our first confirmation of community level transmission. So prior to this, all the cases in Canada were through travel. And the vast majority of those cases were either from Europe or, ironically, a little later, we learned from the United States. If we continue to look at virus numbers, so it took us more than a month, almost a month and a half to get to 10 cases. And then once we got to that level, it only took 3 weeks to go up 10-fold. 3 weeks after that, it went up 100-fold. So we saw this exponential growth from, it took 3 weeks to multiply our numbers by 10. It took another 3 weeks to multiply that number by 100. So this is exactly what viruses do. They have this exponential growth. Now, the really good news is since early April, we have seen a steady decline in most of Canada. So if we look at April 2nd to yesterday, where we have about 35,000 cases, it took a month and a half only to go up 3.5-fold. So we are seeing a slowing of viral spread in Canada. And this is really encouraging. And this is the evidence we need to begin to open up our restrictions within the community. Now, it's important to keep in mind that although the numbers are coming down, the virus is not gone. And this is one of the big problems we're having with making decisions for the future. So this is a bit of a representation of not new cases, but the total number of cases in Canada from really the onset of the virus until about the middle of April. And what we find is, although we are now a little lower than this, we're coming down, which is great. We have to keep in mind that this small number of cases here led to this huge spike. And the fact that we still have cases in the community means that if we let our guard down, if we return to everyday life prior to the lockdown, this small number of cases will result in another spike. So we have to be careful that we don't need a high number of cases in the community to cause a problem. Even a small number of cases, if we're making the wrong decisions and not taking the right precautions, will unfortunately result again in a large number of patients in Canada. Now, along those lines, it's also important to note that the viral distribution and the number of cases in Canada is not uniform province to province. And that really, given the size of our country, we have a collection or a confederation of outbreaks, and each province is following its own dynamics and its own timeline. So I've only highlighted a couple provinces here, but we can see, for example, Quebec had a slow start and then a much more rapid expansion as it entered long-term care facilities. Places like Ontario spiked a little bit earlier and then maintained a fairly steady number of cases. And in contrast, Alberta was extremely slow, really good control early on, followed by finally a break in containment and a small uptick in cases. So each province has its own dynamics. And as a result, a reopening plan nationwide is likely not a good strategy, and that we need to consider not necessarily provinces as individual units, but regions, and look at the dynamics of the virus within a general area rather than arbitrary city or provincial borders. What we did in Canada, and what we did quite well, was this concept of flattening the curve. And this is a decision that was made as soon as the first few cases appeared. And this is a public health strategy. So what we're trying to do, and what this term means, we've all heard it in the media, is we are trying to avoid this sharp spike in cases. So this pink curve represents what happens if there's no social distancing. So the number of viral cases expands exponentially, and we get a maximum number of cases that far exceeds this dotted line, which is the capacity of our healthcare system. This is what happened in northern Italy. This is the last thing we want to happen here. So what we did is we brought in a number of measures between travel restrictions and social distancing. And what we've been able to do is we've been able to lower this. So we don't get this high peak of cases. And instead, our peak is much further down, below the capacity of our healthcare system, which means all sick patients can get the medical care they need. The difference, though, is we are still going to get the same number of cases, presumably. We have no protection. We do not yet have a vaccine to stop people from getting infected. So what happens is, instead of a large spike in cases, we get a much lower level for a longer period of time. So we've achieved a plateau stage where we have a stable, small amount of viral transmission in the community. So new cases are going to continue to crop up for the next several months, but at no point are we going to threaten the capacity of the healthcare system. So this is a public health decision. It doesn't necessarily prevent people from getting infected throughout the course of their life, but it is going to prevent a massive peak at any one point, which means we can better care for patients. And this has been shown to help prevent fatalities. So how effective was this? So we do realize that this required massive sacrifice, not only from industry and companies in Canada, but from the individual Canadians. And we're always wanting to see that if we made a sacrifice, we receive some benefit in return. And this is a comparison of the viral growth rate in a number of different countries. And for example, I just want to call attention to Canada's curve. So this little dark maroon line here, versus the United States curve. So the height of the curves are a little bit different. These are total number of cases. So that's maybe not surprising. They have more people, they will probably have more cases. But what's really critical is this angle, how steep this line is. This tells you how many cases are appearing every day. This is the rate of cases. And we can see here that Canada's curve was much more gentle, much flatter curve, which means we never spiked. We did not end up with a situation such as they faced in New York, where they had to bring in medical ships to the harbor to house extra patients. So we've had a very stunning success. And in fact, compared to most countries on this curve, we had the slowest viral growth of most developed nations. So the personal sacrifices made directly paid dividends to our public health and to the overall survival of our friends and neighbors. So how has COVID actually spread? Well, this has been probably the most confusing piece of information in the news. And the reason for that is our knowledge is continually growing. Initially, we believed it was spread only through very close personal contact, so touching somebody, housemates, spouses, things that required very close physical contact. From there, we learned that it can be spread through droplets in the air up to 6 feet or a little bit further even. And today we're learning that some of these droplets, even from somebody talking, can last in the air for more than 10 minutes. So having somebody in your office chatting for 10 minutes could then populate the airspace with virally infected particles. This is why the recommendation for everybody to wear a mask has come into play. The mask will not protect you if you're not infected, but it will stop these particles, these droplets, from entering the air in a room or in an area where we cannot maintain social distancing. The final method is we also have learned, and this appears to be quite clear evidence now, that we can touch subjects or touch things that have been contaminated and then touch our own face and become infected. This is perhaps the more difficult aspect to control, because this is often the little thing we don't think of. So whereas we can wear masks and maintain 6 feet of separation to stop the droplets, we don't realize that every single person who entered a room touched the same doorknob, or every single person who used the same restroom touched the same hand dryer. So there is a risk of these common touch points becoming viral hotspots, and then anybody who touches that object afterwards is at risk of infecting themselves. So this is really where the difficulty in keeping a safe and clean workplace comes in. Now, we've heard a lot of people saying, well, this is just another flu and we should treat it like the flu, and we don't shut the country down every time there's a new flu in the fall. And I understand the argument, but it is important to point out that COVID-19 is not an influenza. It's a different kind of virus, and clinically it behaves very differently. So if we compare the two, we have this little term called an RO number. This is roughly how many other people one infected person will infect on average. So in flu, each person who gets sick on average infects another 1.3 people. For COVID, we know that that number goes up dramatically. So each infected person on average infects 2 to 2.5 people. Now it's important to note that this is an average. The vast majority of COVID infected people actually don't infect anybody else. So that's saying that in order for this average to be this high, the people who are spreading the virus are likely infecting 10 or 15 other people. So although most people who have it may be of low threat to spread the virus, there are super spreaders in our community that can end up basically infecting an entire workplace in a matter of a couple days. So this is what we really have to guard against. Likewise, if we look at incubation time flu, once you're exposed to the virus, you get sick pretty quick. What does this mean? Well, it means that there's less chance of you going about your daily life not knowing you're infected. So you're going to stay home when you're not feeling well, and you're going to stop spreading the virus. With COVID, it could be 2 weeks before you start developing symptoms. The whole time, you may have been out in the community spreading the virus to other people. So this creates a big problem, and likely why our RO number is higher for COVID. Hospitalization rate, very few people, although we do hear about them in the news, on average, very few people are hospitalized for flu, about 2%. In contrast, about 1 in 5 end up requiring some form of hospital care from the people that have symptoms with COVID-19. And then finally, fatality rate, for the number of people infected with flu, it's less than 1%. In most studies, on an average flu season, it's actually 0.02% of people who get the flu have a fatality. With COVID, we are seeing on, again, the symptomatic patients. I cannot comment on the asymptomatic. We don't have a good grasp of how many they are. But people presenting with symptoms, anywhere from 1 to 3.5% of people with symptoms will unfortunately succumb to this illness. So it is a very different disease than flu, and for that reason, we simply cannot treat it as a flu. So now I must apologize. We'll get into the virology or the biochemistry of this virus. I just want to introduce a couple really quick slides so that we can understand how the testing works. So this is our culprit here. This is the SARS-CoV-2. And what this is it basically, it's a little bag of lipid or a little bag of fat. This little circle is basically the outer lining of our own cells. The virus steals our material when it makes a copy of itself. On the outside of these proteins, these are known, these big yellow ones are known as spike protein. You will have heard this in the media, and I'll talk about the spike protein in a minute. And then inside is the genetic material. So this little sausage-looking thing, this is messenger RNA or mRNA, and this is how it makes proteins. So this is all a virus is. It's not alive. It's a little bag of genetic material. And that's why it's actually quite easy to kill. If we add any detergent, this outer shell falls apart and the virus is completely inactivated. The way the virus works is it uses those little proteins, those spike proteins on its surface to stick to a receptor we have on our cells, known as ACE2. So this is a protein on our cells. The virus sticks with those little yellow proteins and it gets pulled into our cell. The virus falls apart and it starts using our cells' proteins and machinery to copy itself. And eventually it makes copies of its genome, its RNA, and it makes copies of its protein, and then it will package a new virus that's released to go and infect both other cells in our body, but also other people. The reason why I wanted to show this is there's two things I want to just follow up on future slides. So this idea of the spike protein is how it gets into our cells, but also this stage here of viral replication where it copies its genome, where it makes more RNA. This is actually the target of our screens right now in Canada. So when you get a nasal swab, this is what they're looking for. They're trying to measure the amount of RNA in your body that comes from the virus. And that will tell you whether you have an active infection or not. So if the virus is outside your cell, no RNA. When you release new virus, no RNA. Only when it's replicating do we get that. So our test tells the clinician who has an active infection. Now, testing has been a huge success in Canada. I think that this is something that is dramatically understated. We very much lead the world not only in quantity of testing, but quality of testing. Our tests that we use in various provincial health agencies have the lowest rate of false positive and the lowest rate of false negative worldwide. So we have, perhaps, despite what a certain individual south of the border may say, we do have the best validated testing in Canada. And part of that is because, for example, in Alberta, we do not test for one viral gene. We actually look for, depending on which test is being used, 4 to 5 viral genes, and you have to identify all of them. That way, if the virus mutates and, for example, one gene doesn't amplify or is not detected, we're still going to pick up on the other 3. So ours has a lot of redundancy, a lot of robustness, and very reliable results. If we look at the number of tests per capita across the country, we see that actually all provinces are performing quite well. Many other jurisdictions are under 1,000 tests per 100,000 people. In, for example, Alberta, we're at 4,000. So this is fantastic testing capacity. And when we adjust that as total number, again, we can see in Alberta, we've tested over, or almost, this is now a couple days old, over 200,000 people. Ontario has tested nearly 500,000 people. So these are fantastic performance for a country with 1/10 the population, for example, of the US. So what are we doing with the test? So as I said, the test measures that RNA. So it detects an active infection. And if we look at this chart, this is mapping the virus in your body. So this blue line is the amount of virus you have. And you're going to get infected on day 0. And then by about 3 weeks, you've cleared the virus on average. This blue line is what our test picks up. So you have to be at the hospital during the time that this blue line is high. If you come in on this day, you're probably going to test negative. And if you come in on this day or after day 21, you will also test negative, and it will look like you never had the virus. So although this is a little bit problematic, it's still very informative. It tells us who has to be isolated at that point because that is who is currently infected. The new testing we're talking about is this idea of antibody testing. And what that measures is our immune response. So once we've started to fight off the virus, our body makes these little guys over here. So this is an antibody, this Y-shaped protein. And what it does is on the ends of these 2 arms, right out at this site here, it actually sticks to the virus. It labels the virus, and by sticking to it, it can coat it and block the virus from entering our body. So over the course of an infection, here's our virus again in blue line. By about a week, we start to make one kind of antibody known as IgM. This is a good antibody. It's not great. It's pretty weak at sticking to it, but it's our stopgap. After about 2 weeks, we make this red line, this IgG. This is the best antibodies we can make. This is what we try to generate through vaccination, and this is what our test is looking for. So the advantage here is this can remain high for years. So if we test somebody for antibody anytime from near the end of their infection out for 2 or 3 years, we will have proof that you've already had the infection and you fought it off. So this is a much bigger testing window. This also identifies the asymptomatic people and allows us to get a much better picture of what's happening in the community. We can identify all people that ever had the virus, not just who's infected today. So this is an important tool. So as I said, the conventional testing looks after this, and if the virus isn't actually replicating, we miss it. So what we're looking for in these new generation of tests are these guys. This is the antibody that can bind to the surface of the virus, and in doing this, this destroys the virus. This stops it from infecting our cells. Why does it do that? Well, these little knobs on the surface, this is that spike protein, and the antibody's covering them. So if you cover the spike protein, it cannot bind to our cells and it can't get in. So this is our overall goal with vaccination, but this is also what we're measuring in this test. So if we look at a testing strategy, while the virus is actively infecting this blue line here, this is where the nasal swabs work best. After you start to clear that infection, now we're going to look for the antibodies in the blood. So there are two different tests that really address two different questions. Now, I have seen a lot of excitement in the media that this might tell us who's protected, who has immunity, who can safely go back to work and not worry about being reinfected. And I think that this is a very dangerous concept and something that really needs to be explored in more detail. So the reason for that is the presence of antibodies doesn't tell you whether you're infectious or not. So using that to better predict who's safe to go into the community, not the best idea. So if we're looking for surveillance of the overall population, it's the great way to do it. Whether you test positive or negative, there's no risk of infecting others. People with symptoms, though, if you're positive, there's a high risk of infecting others. So we have to be careful in how we use the test. The biggest problem, though, with the antibody test, and this is my last two slides, is we have to understand exactly what we're measuring. So in an ideal world, what we're looking for is, here's our little coronavirus again with the spike proteins. We are hoping that the antibodies are binding to the end of the spike protein and blocking them. So this thing cannot stick to us. We've covered all its little Velcro sites. So this would be great. This is exactly what we want a vaccine to do. If this is the case, you are now protected. Unfortunately, the test we use doesn't tell us this. Our test tells us that the antibody sticks to the coronavirus. So the antibody could actually stick to the wrong part of the spike protein and the Velcro site is still exposed. So this virus can still get into you, or it could recognize a completely different part of the virus. And again, there's no protection if you have these antibodies. It's only proof that you had been exposed before, but you may not be protected today. Likewise, the first generation of tests that were approved by the FDA. So these are tests that were not approved in Canada, and there was a lot of public outcry that we are not following the FDA. As it turns out, it cannot tell the difference between the SARS coronavirus and the coronavirus that causes the common cold. So if you had ever had a cold in your life, you tested positive for these antibody tests. And we were basically telling people you now had immunity, you are safe to go back into the public, and they had never actually seen the coronavirus. So we have to be really careful. These are an important tool for public health, but we are not at the point yet where they mean immunity. So a positive antibody test today does not equal protection. It's going to be a critical tool as we move forward, but we have to be sure we use this data carefully and not blindly assume people are protected. So with that, I'm just going to leave it with a little COVID humor. And the further we get going on this, the more we realize it's disturbingly accurate. And I'll be happy to take questions at the end if there are any.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jenny. Excellent presentation. I'm sure everyone, like myself, learned a lot there. And it also reinforces, you know, some of the behaviors that we're being told that we have to maintain, so that all this great work that people in your community and others have done so far to keep the curve flattened and to make this progress in terms of trying to find a vaccine doesn't go to waste. You know, we want to be going back to work in a way that's totally responsible, so that, you know, where the curve stays flat as much as possible. And it also kind of reinforces, you know, just the standard protocols that we're all discussing, you know, making sure our surfaces are totally clean. And one thing that's occurred to me time and time again is the miracle of soap. So we have this bar of soap, which is very inexpensive, which is readily available, and thank goodness it's effective. You know it, and you explained the protein out membranes and spikes very well, and it's just I think that's one thing we have going for us is that ordinary soap dissolves that protein and kills it off. So I'm sure we have some questions for you towards the end. So thanks again for that, Dr. Jenny. And uh, we're pleased to introduce Tony Melnichuk, who's the Director of Labor and Employee Relations, and he's going to speak to us from that HR business perspective. And if you're ready to go, Tony, we'll turn it over to you.
Absolutely. Okay, thanks, Jeff. Good morning, everybody. Today I'm going to change it up a little bit. Again, thanks, Craig and Chris. Those are awesome presentations. But mine will be just my face. I'll have no things to share. But I'm going to talk a little bit about some factors for you to consider on bringing your employees back to the workplace, specifically from an HR and people perspective. So I'm going to touch on a few areas. I'm going to talk about your organization a little bit, talk about your people. I'm going to talk about your plan to return and some quick logistics on getting back to the office. So we'll see if I can tweak some ideas for you to use in your particular situation. And as Jeff said in the beginning, no two businesses are the same, and your situations may vary, greatly depending on how you're managing through the crisis. So I encourage you to take and seek out HR and legal advice on any issues that are really complex. So I'm talking about layoffs, permanent reductions. Maybe you have some constructive dismissal claims kind of hanging out there, or you're thinking about salary adjustments, in a crisis. Those are issues you need to really seek out professional HR and legal advice. So, having said that, when I take kind of a step back and I look at, the governments and health authorities are now starting to deliver on their plans to reopen our society. We're all thinking about, now what? Like, how do we get our employees back to the offices, in a safe way? And, I purposely used the word reopen our society because I really feel that the return isn't a purely economic one. It's impacting our employees at a level that's never been seen before. Safety, health, well-being, financial stability, even the people connections has been tested through this virus. And if you think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, it's been kind of blown out of the water for this whole crisis because a lot of the requirements of kind of human nature have been tested. So leaders really need to understand this and be attuned to this when they're bringing your employees back. I think one of the things that COVID-19 has taught us, it's never more important to focus on your physical and mental safety of your employees than now. The safety is critical, obviously, to employees, but it's also critical for your business to be sustainable. So leaders who take their time and are thoughtful in bringing the employees back will be better positioned once the economy does return. And we start building a healthy workforce, and a healthy workplace is going to be a competitive advantage. So those are kind of the key points I'm thinking about. If you have an EFAP program, which is your employee and family assistance programs, if you have a formal program, or maybe a not so formal program like Not Myself Today, you need to leverage those resources and ensure your employees get the help they need. So there are some great resources out there, and employees, you need to be, as leaders, again, pointing to that and being very open about, your mental health and how you are using those resources as well. Today's webinar speaks to kind of the business relaunch. And when I think about, a business relaunch, I can't help but thinking of JFK's, famous quote. He said, when written in Chinese, and it's kind of funny, it's Chinese, but when it's written in Chinese, the word crisis is composed of two letters. One represents danger, and one represents opportunity. So today, I think we all have a great opportunity to develop new ways of working and new ways of being successful. So this isn't something that's going to happen overnight. You're going to need to take a measured approach. And so here's some ideas I think that I'm hoping that you can work in your organization about. So I kind of start off kind of at the highest level. So let's look at your organization. Many businesses developed their organizational structure over time, and it wasn't taking a holistic view, and it wasn't talked about here's the business plan and let's plan for it. It kind of happened real time. And if you think about a small business that just started, you're working and all of a sudden, gee, you need a finance person, you hire one, and then that finance person gets overly busy and they needed an accountant, get an accountant, and we need a payroll person, and the payroll person needs some admin help, and all of a sudden, before you know it, you have a whole financial department. and that's the way a lot of companies grow, and that's fine. But right now, you're given this opportunity to take a step back and evaluate the structure of your organization. And maybe it's time to rethink your business model. So the depth of your review of your organization can vary to a real detailed analysis of your core value proposition and revenue model, to a simple SWOT analysis. It's up to you. But again, in today's world, we're given this opportunity to have a look at the organization. And I'm seeing a lot of organizations I work with bringing together small teams of senior people, senior leaders, maybe their board directors or their consultants, to have a look at the design of the business and take a look at what the potential might be going into the future. So if you need some motivation to think about that, Peter Drucker, the father of modern management theory, once said, every organization must be prepared to abandon everything it does to survive in the future. So he said that in 1999, and I can't think of a better call to action today. So if you have the opportunity to pull together a small team of trusted leaders from your organization and review some of your business perspective, this is the time to do it. It's also time maybe to think about reaching out to your industry partners and understanding what they may be doing in this crisis time, because there may be some synergies that you didn't expect to see, or chances to collaborate that you never did before. So again, it's only when you start looking at your business through this different lens do you really kind of get some sense of new opportunities. So if you've kind of looked at your organization from the 10,000 foot level, let's kind of drop down a little bit, and kind of one of your tasks might be to look at your critical roles and how they fit in your organization. Are they exposing you to some heightened risks? For example, I think about a critical position, holding organizational knowledge that maybe has no backup. So my example of that is, it's always that accountant or bookkeeper you always see in the back of a smoky bar in the back room doing all the money, and the cash is on the table, and they're calculating everything and doing the finances. And if that person ever was to win the lottery, the business would crater because nobody knows what they do. Nobody knows the secrets of it. Do you have critical roles like that in your organization that, if the person was to leave, what would happen? So when you can look at critical roles, you can kind of categorize them two different ways. You can think about the impact on the business specifically. So essentially the value that role contributes to the success of the business. And then you can also look at the expertise and the focus required at that level for skill and maybe experience required to do the job. So you can use really this last several months as a gauge to determine how your critical roles have impacted your business continuity. So when you take a look at those roles, take an inventory of them. Understand the full picture of the risks they have for your organization, and also take a look at some of the employees that you may have that are suitable for those roles. You can utilize that information for future succession planning, but also you can take a look at upskilling. So is this the time to maybe look at those roles and say, the marketplace might have some great talent available today, and I can actually upskill in some of those roles and bring new people into the organization now. So there's some thoughts around that. Also, perhaps you can think about outsourcing specific areas of weakness. Some areas could be outsourced. I know it's tough times to think about that, but the gaps that have been exposed because of this crisis, your business gaps, will give you some really good data to evaluate if there's specific areas that maybe could be outsourced. So now kind of the from that level, I want to drop down to your employees, your people that are working today. Over the last few months, you probably gained some great insights on employees who maybe have really stepped up and become key contributors. You want to hold on to those folks. You want to kind of look at maybe they warrant a promotion now, or maybe they need a change in roles. Again, it's kind of looking for that diamond in the rough during a crisis. And don't forget them during the relaunch. Give them some new responsibilities right away so that you can continually test them as the relaunch continues. And there are also maybe other employees that currently are not meeting your expectations. But be careful on judging them too harshly. As I said, this crisis has challenged everything we know and has introduced new stresses that from every angle. So for employees that may not be weathering the storm quite well right now, you may want to take a longer look at their performance. But then you'll also have employees that are clear non-performers. And there are some, and you may see that kind of highlighted in the crisis. But you do have some options for them. There's temporary layoffs or permanent reductions. And again, I suggest, in your own particular situation, you maybe talk to get some HR advice on those situations. So let's shift a little bit and talk a bit about your plan. So business leaders must provide your people with a clear return plan, a consistent communication, some emotional support, and physical protection in order to get everybody back to work. So today, I think it's around 16% of Canadians said that they would be not comfortable returning back to the office or really out in public fully until there was a vaccine. So 16%, that's a pretty large number. So when you're building your communication plan, there's some critical tips that might be important for you. One of them is be inspirational. Ensure safety is number one. And I talked a bit about that before, about safety and well-being and health of your employees. Make sure that's your number one communication point, because it is. It's critical that your employees are healthy and safety and physically protected. Over communicate. Talk about your plan. Talk about your plan that might change. When your plan changes, talk about the change that just happened. And by the way, talk about your plan again. Talk about your timing, and then talk about your plan again. You cannot over communicate the plan of bringing people back, or what you're thinking about in your process. Because if leaders don't continually communicate, that feeds paranoia and insecurity. And in a time when both paranoia and insecurity are very high in our employee population, you as a leader need to just continually over communicate. You also need to be seen when the teams return to work. So your plan is to bring people back, and if the leaders aren't the first people in the office when people walk in, that's going to send a clear message. So again, make yourself part of the plan. Two-way communication has always been critically important, so employee and customer concerns need to be heard. And that is probably something you're doing now, but that continues to be really important to make sure that you get the feedback from your employees and customers. So while you're building your communication plan, you may start thinking about kind of what are the numbers to return to the workplace. And I'm kind of hearing a lot of companies are looking at less than 10% to start. So I think kind of the clear kind of message is don't be in a hurry. You don't need to bring back 100% of your employees at once, and logistically and probably business-wise, it doesn't make any sense to do that. But we're going to know just statistically that many of your employees are going to want to come back to work. They're going to want to come back to the office because working from home is difficult. Like Chris said, it's hard, and people are working a lot more, and the office gives you that stability, that kind of the rhythm again. So there are people that are going to want to come back, while others won't want to come back. They're not going to feel safe yet. They may have underlying medical issues, or living with elderly parents, or may be part of that 16% that are kind of waiting for the vaccine to show up. And then yet you're going to have others that decide, I can permanently work from home because it supports my personal schedule. So business owners and leaders are really going to have to make some challenging decisions on what your employees want, and and how to meet the business requirements, because the needs of the employees and their view of the right answer might be different than the businesses. So you're going to have to really be creative when it comes to kind of looking at some of those roles. So one way to gauge kind of the employee's willingness to come back is you could ask for volunteers. So, what that gives you is an idea of how many employees actually really want to come back to the office. But what a volunteer call doesn't give you is if they really shouldn't come back. And what I mean by that is there are some people that you maybe don't want to come back to the office just yet. In order to kind of find that out, you could maybe plan to have some questions for them. And questions not like a survey where they answer questions and send back to you, but more of use the questions as a self-reflection for them to determine if they really want to volunteer to come back. And this assists you with privacy legislation as well, and I'll explain that in a sec. So some of the questions might be, and this one's pretty obvious when you talk about privacy, is you could ask them to consider, are you currently vulnerable due to your age or a pre-existing medical condition? Now, you don't want them to answer that. You don't want to know any of that, but you want them to consider that and think about it when they're thinking about volunteering. Also, you could ask them, are you currently living with older individuals over 60, which you cannot effectively physically distance from, and who may have underlying medical conditions such as cardiovascular disease, diabetes, chronic respiratory disease, or cancer. You could also ask them, are you caring for minor children that require childcare? And another one that's just interesting one is you can actually ask them if they live or have close interactions with others who are frontline workers in this crisis. So, or potentially can be exposed to the virus just kind of by working. Their spouse maybe is in the medical field. So by asking these questions, what you're doing is you're giving them the ability to kind of, without invading their privacy, having them consider the implications of returning to the workplace given their personal circumstances. So that might be a tool you could use. And just as an FYI, you can't force certain employees back to work. Like if they're employees on a government mandated sick leave for isolation, obviously you can't and wouldn't want to bring them back to work. But also if an employee is on family responsibility leave, so they're specifically looking after minor children who have no daycare or school to go to, you can't mandate them to back to work. So just for information's sake. So how might work change in your organization once you're starting to think kind of down the road? Employees, through kind of technology and everything else, employees are going to want to work differently. They're going to want to pivot quicker. They're going to want to have less bureaucracy, faster response. They're going to want to be more creative. They want less protocols, less approvals, less processes. It's interesting. I've had the opportunity, I guess, to work through a lot of crises in Alberta. The first Slave Lake fires and then the Fort McMurray fires and the floods through Calgary. And the organization I work for kind of had to go through all those. And what we found was during a crisis, a lot of the protocols, approvals, and processes went away. Everybody worked to meet the crisis needs. Everybody made the right decisions. Everybody didn't kind of run it up the ladder. And it proved out to be efficient and the right thing to do. After the crisis, everything kind of rolled back to the protocols kicked in and everybody's approvals kicked in and the processes returned. And then we asked ourselves why. Why did we need to do that when in a crisis mode, everybody's there and focused and makes the right decisions. But after the crisis is over, you return back to the hierarchy of decision making. So something to really think about there. Like I said before, remote work is going to be a key one. I think when you get to that point, you're going to have to work on some remote working schedules and agreements to define kind of what that work looks like specifically. But also it's going to give you some opportunities and flexibilities. The example I like to give is if you have an employee who has school-age kids and maybe they're paying for after-school care and they're working 100% of the time. If they're working from home, they might be open to working a 0.75 FTE. And then at at 3 o'clock or 2:30, they go pick up their kids from school, and then they alleviate the after-school care costs. So financially, in the end, they may be kind of equal to having worked full-time, but they get to pick up their kids at school, and as a business, you now have a 0.75 FTE to pay for as opposed to a full one. So it's those flexible thoughts and ideas that people are going to probably come up to you with, or you're going to want to talk about with your employees, because this, again, the crisis gives you the opportunity to test all this stuff. A recent survey I read said companies are expecting to see nearly 20% of their workforce remotely working after the crisis. So, again, technology will be really important in that. And I often think about business travel now, after the crisis, how much, business travel is going to change due to this technology, that we can easily get together, a bunch of people and have a meeting like this without everybody traveling somewhere. So again, technology is going to be key, and Cash, I'm sure you'll talk about that. And again, look at that as a way to be creative with your employees. But again, that it's going to be all dependent on your business and what ability you have to support those different terms and conditions of employment. So some organizations will need to have people in the office. And a great way to manage that is the introduction of shifts. So shifts allow you kind of to be able to work the workplace, I guess, in different ways. So you're able to place people in the workplace at a smaller number, with clearly assigned desks, which give you the physical distancing you need to maintain employees on the same shift, while making the office space larger. It also allows as little as your cleaning contractor will know, when they can come in and clean your office when the employees aren't there. So it becomes, the ability to be flexible in the workspace helps. When you're looking at different shifts, look at the stop and start times as well, because ask your employees how they get to work. If some use public transit, you may want to alter your start times and stop times to be off peak. So again, it's just kind of looking and seeing what works best for your business and what works best for your employees. Someone had talked about best practices early on, and I smirked a bit because really there's no best practice for returning to work yet. This is going to be new for everybody, but be creative. See what you can do with the employees, again, with safety being number one in your life. So logistically, just kind of a few things. Teams are going to be challenged with the logistics of planning and implementing a return. Again, safety is going to be critical. Refer to the guidance outlined in a lot of the government websites. There's some really good practical information on government websites on returning to the workplace. But I'll give you just a quick few just to think about. You can think about temperature checking at home before the employee comes to work. You can do it at work, but that becomes a little cumbersome with a nurse at the front door or someone. But that may be something you need to do. The self-assessment checklist before every employee comes to work every morning probably should be a mandatory one. Think about your personal protective equipment at work. Again, ensure your supply chain is well prepared to kind of the onslaught. And again, to Chris's point about training, make sure that everyone's trained on PPE. Rethink the density and prioritization of physical distancing. So again, your office could move things around, change things around. You can think about bringing critical workers in to the office maybe sooner if you really have a critical need for them, and maybe isolate them from the rest of the team. If they are truly critical, maybe there's a place you can park them so they're even isolated from the isolation. The time frame between each group phasing back also may be based on your business need and the continued health of the employees. Again, to Craig's point, they're thinking about if there's another peak coming, you're going to have to be pretty flexible to change back again. If you've brought people back into work and we're seeing a large spike of sickness in your workplace, then you may have to go back to working from home. So there's some flexibility to think about there. Think about access points, elevators, hallways, bottlenecks towards the washrooms, arrows on the floors and walls like you're seeing in all the stores. Remove all excess seating. Use conference rooms and break spaces as work areas. A key one is your vendors and third-party suppliers on site. I mean, they have to know what your plan is. They have to understand what the policies are. So they have to be educated if they're going to be, part of your group or be seen in your office. And then the last three I always kind of chuckle about because I have no idea what people are going to do about these is the coffee machine, the lunchrooms, and the dreaded fridges. I've always thought fridges in a workplace were a germ factory. So good luck. I don't know what you're going to do with them going forward, but you're going to have to think about having everybody's lunches stuck in a fridge. So really, in closing, I just want to thank you for spending your time on this webinar, and I hope I've given you some good information that you can use to integrate your workforce. But I'd like to leave you with a couple key points. And the decisions you make today as a leader in your organization are going to impact your business's reputation for years to come. And remember that the crisis, when it's over and your business is standing up again, you're going to be out recruiting for new employees. And how you treated your employees through this transition is going to impact the employees you hire in the future. And that's your competitive advantage. And again, kind of back to Jeff's first point, no situation is the same. Oh, I think I muted out there.
You're back. Yeah.
So again, I think I left off at if you have complex issues, kind of please reach out to HR and to any legal advice you need for the complex ones. And other than that, stay safe, everybody. And back to you, Jeff.
Thank you so much, Tony. Wow, what a lot of great information you provided us with. That's really great. Yeah, one of the many takeaways for me is seeing this, as the opportunity to step back a little bit and broaden our awareness of our behaviors, not only in the workplace, but, structurally, looking at our business structures and business models that we've assumed are the only way of doing things, for years, and reevaluating everything as we move forward with safety as our number one goal. So thank you so much again. We have some great questions for you later on if you hang in there. Now we're going to turn over to the president and CEO of Shing Digital, Mr. Kash Wang. Kash.
Thank you, Jeff. So let me just share my screen here. And I have to say, wow, I've got to follow three great panelists that provided that much information. Honestly, I think I'm a little nervous, presenting after those guys. But thank you guys very much. And Tony, it was some great information in terms of some guiding principles in terms of some of the HR. I think I learned a ton from it, and I think we're definitely going to go back and take a look at some of our plans. But today I wanted to sort of present operationally what our plan is going to look like, and hopefully that can sort of help some people on their plan. Now, little cheeky there in terms of our plan is the Shing Digital Pandexit plan. I stole that off the internet because I just thought it was kind of cheeky. But certainly, to Tony's point, make sure you have a plan, make sure you communicate that plan. And the plan that we've come up with for our company is going to line up to the stages or the phases that the Alberta government has put out in terms of their stage 1, their stage 2, and their stage 3, and ultimately stage 4 is, back to some sort of normalcy. Now, for our company, we wanted to make sure that we were taking everything that the government was saying and make sure that it was customized to what is going to work for our business. And again, what's going to work for our business is going to be different from your business. So make sure you take everything that I'm showing you here and see how you can adapt that to what you do. Now, for us, stage 1, which was supposed to be today, but I think in Southern Alberta, that's delayed another 10 days, is going to be for us a limited return. And to Tony's point, our stage 1 limited return is going to be our leaders. It's going to be our leaders that are going to come back to the office first, because we really should be the tip of the spear as leaders of the organization. And part of that isn't only to show confidence to our staff and to our clients, but also to help the preparations for when we do get to stage 2 and to stage 3. So that is our plan for stage 1. Once we get to stage 2 and the gearing up of starting to bring more of the staff back, again, it's going to be bringing staff back that makes sense and in a limited fashion. And we're also going to be rotating them between when they're going to be in the office and when they're going to continue to work at home. Now, for our business, many of the functions that we can do can be done remotely, or at least stuff that we did do in the office can be done remotely. So we have the flexibility to be able to bring a limited number of people back, and then to rotate them in terms of the desks as well, to make sure that we have all the distance necessary. And so they're not sharing desks or potentially, sharing any of the viruses that might still be living on the surface. And of course, once we get to stage 3, we're going to be bringing a lot more of our folks back into the office. But even during stage 3, because we have the flexibility, we're going to be doing a lot more of that rotation on days when staff need to be in the office and when they don't need to be. So, from that standpoint, us as a company have a little bit more flexibility than, say, a restaurant, right, or a courier company. So we've got some of that flexibility that we can play with, and we're taking full advantage of that to again, make sure that we have not only the confidence of our staff, but the confidence of our clients as well, that we're doing everything we can within our framework to make sure everybody is safe. Now, that being said, we're also going to be more the tortoise than the hare, right? In that, as a company policy, our opening of our stages is going to lag at least 2 weeks behind any government announcement. It gives us the flexibility that if there's any change from a public health perspective, or just in government policy or things that we're seeing from a company perspective, that we've got that time to readjust our plan as necessary. I think from a lot of what we've learned from this pandemic is that, nothing is set in stone, right? We get new announcements every day from our prime ministers, our prime ministers, our premiers, our mayors about this constant changing situation. And what they told us yesterday may not be relevant today. So we always want to make sure that we have that time lag so that we can adjust and make the right decisions for our company, and our clients. And of course, from a company perspective, to Tony's point about providing PPE, we always wanted to make sure that we announced that we're providing face masks to all the staff. Now, I think they had this in mind, right? And maybe someday, yes, but this was more what we had in mind. So as a company, some things that we're doing is we're making sure that we're providing reusable as well as disposable masks for all of our staff to utilize. So it's an investment that we put into our staff because we want to make sure that they feel safe, and also that when they're on client doing projects for clients, that the clients feel safe, and that we've taken all of the steps necessary to make sure that we have that. And in the overall scheme of the business, I mean, really, some masks aren't a big cost to the business. They're hard to find, but we want to make sure that we put in that investment, that we're finding that for our clients. So we sourced all of ours from a great Alberta company that made it all local. So extra bonus there, and then they were mailed out to all the staff, so that way they didn't have to come into the office to get that. And then at all of our offices, we have the disposable masks in case their masks are dirty, they forget to wash it, whatever the case may be. But we want to make sure that we give them all the tools necessary to properly do their job and feel comfortable while they're doing their jobs as well. And of course, with the face coverings, we also make sure that in all of our offices that we stock all the disinfecting products as well. For when employees want to wipe things down, whether it be a phone, whether it be a door handle, it doesn't matter. We've made sure that we've stocked up enough so that our staff can feel comfortable that, hey, if something wasn't clean, that they can quickly take one and clean whatever they need to. And again, not only does it come down to the cleanliness and killing the virus, but it also comes down to make sure that we try to address any anxieties that our staff may have at any point in time, right? And the other thing that we're also going to be doing is making sure that all of our staff are issued hand sanitizer in little bottles as well. So again, that way they can use it whenever and wherever they need. So these are, quite honestly, for a company, I think some very little things that we can do to make sure that the staff don't have that anxiety, and to make sure that we're taking the necessary precautions. Now, with all that as well, we also need to make sure that all of our common surfaces are clean. So, all of our surfaces are going to be cleaned twice a day. So again, to make sure that our staff have that confidence. And to Tony's point, I don't know how often we're going to be using any of the common microwaves or even refrigerators for the next little while. But certainly we need to make sure that they're clean, especially common and high touch areas such as doorknobs or even some of the common tables. So we want to make sure that the staff have that confidence that we're doing everything we can. And of course, none of that replaces things like frequent hand washing. It's something that we've conveyed to our staff, not only while they're in the office, that the facilities are there. We've provided touchless soap dispensers to make sure that they don't have to pump any soap dispensers in order to wash their hands. But also when they go to client locations as well, that before they go to the client location, that their hands are washed or they're using the sanitizer. And the same thing after they leave a client's location as well, is to either wash the hands or use the hand sanitizer. We want to make sure that we're not bringing anything that we shouldn't be into client's location, and we also want to make sure that we're not leaving with something as well. So this is something very simple, but a very important policy that we're making sure all of our staff follow. Right. And of course, another step that we're going to be taking, I wish I had heard Tony's talk before, but we're definitely going to be changing some of our policies in terms of some of the temperature checking and even those self-health checks. So we're making sure that when our staff come back into the office, whether it be first thing in the morning or after they come back from client site, that we've got some non-contact thermometers that we can check the temperature of all our staff. Now, one of the things we've relayed to our staff is, if you're feeling a little warm, if you're not feeling very well, there's no penalty to go home and work, right? And we make sure we've gone to pains to convey that to our staff, that it's not like we're in a normal time where if you're sick, we send you home on a sick day, right? And are you out of sick days? Well, now we want to make sure we convey to them that today that doesn't matter, right? Today it's about making sure that you're safe, that you protect the safety of your coworkers and the safety of the clients. So, we try to do non-invasive methods, but also make sure we convey that confidence to our staff too, that, hey, you know what, you can go work from home today. It's not a big deal, right? And it certainly doesn't count against you. Now, that being said, there's going to be a lot of personal responsibility from all of our clients as well, which is, I love that checklist you talked about, Tony, right? In that, if they aren't feeling very well, they've got a little bit of a cough, even a little bit of a tickle in their throat, right? That they have the choice to stay at home that day, right? There's no penalty from our side, because they can certainly work from home. So we want to make sure we convey that confidence to our staff that, hey, you know what? It's okay. It's fine. We support you as a company, and that work from home, not only is it reality today, it's going to be a reality tomorrow. And of course, while all of our staff are in the office or when at the client locations, we're going to make sure that we want to enforce some social distancing, right? So hence the reason why we're doing the rotations in terms of the staff, where their desks are located and who we're going to be bringing back. So this is just a funny little picture I found on the internet. But those are some of the important steps. They're very simple. They're things that we can follow. Certainly it is a new normal in terms of how we interact. And so, I think as a society, it's going to be something we're going to get used to at least for the next few months, if not for a little bit longer, right? But it's about thinking about that public health, right? It's about thinking about what am I potentially spreading or not spreading. And so, these measures, we always want to make sure that our staff have top of mind. And the last little bit, and I think Tony talked about this, is the mental health aspect of this, right? It's not only about the anxiety, which is fairly high these days in terms of catching the COVID or anything else, but it's about the mental stress sometimes of working from home as well. And so we've put some things in place as everybody's been working from home these last couple of months to make sure that there's constant communication. It's not necessarily about checking up on our staff, but it's more about making sure that they still feel that sense of team, that sense of camaraderie, and that, hey, you know what? Even though you're working from home in your home office, maybe on your dining table, maybe in your basement, that, you know what, you're still not alone. You're still part of a team. You're still part of a company, and that, as a company, we still care about you. So those are some of the steps that we've taken. And to Tony's point about, even some of the folks that take public transit, we're taking feedback from our staff very seriously, right? In that we do have a couple of staff members that do take public transit to the office. And so, they've asked whether or not they can come back at a later stage. And for sure, I mean, our number one priority is to make sure that they feel safe working from the office. Some of them have young kids at home, perhaps they have older parents at home. So we want to make sure that we accommodate that as well. And again, now for our company, we have that flexibility to do that. And so we want to make sure we take full advantage of that to make sure we take care of the mental health of our staff. And out of all of this, we always, after every major event, whether it be this pandemic or a financial crisis or even smaller things, we always want to do a bit of a self-assessment. What are some of the things that we did well? What are some things that we probably could do better and improve on? So for sure, I think some of the things that we had in place in terms of our remote work, we were pretty early in terms of sending everybody to go work from home. So some of the steps that we take to, from an IT perspective, set that up and make sure that that happens, worked very smoothly. And so we were able to very easily transition our entire workforce to go work from home. So those are certainly some things that we did really well. But you know what? Probably one of the proudest things that I can mention in terms of our company is our company culture, right? So that's probably the number one thing that I think we did really well, right? Which is the culture of teamwork, knowledge sharing, and camaraderie. And that's really helped our team get through this challenging time in terms of the distancing from their coworkers and that lack of that day-to-day social interaction that they're having with their teams. So we utilize all of the tools to from the Zoom to the Teams to all the tools we have in place to make sure that our team continually stays in communication and that they continue to have that camaraderie, because the happier and the better the mental health of our staff, the better quality of the work they deliver to our clients. And of course, making the protection of our staff the number one priority, because unlike other companies that have a widget to sell, our product really is our people, right? Without our people, there really isn't a Shing Digital. There really is no company. So the protection of our staff, the mental health of our staff, is always number one in our books in terms of how we protect them. And now some of the things that we could definitely do better on, right? Looking back is always 2020, and so if we had to go back, we would hoard webcams. Okay, webcams are the new toilet paper. Now, all joking aside, we certainly are gonna make sure that remote work at home is going to be a bigger part of our strategy going forward. All right, and as we grow, our strategy was going to be about acquiring more real estate to make sure that we have more space to physically put people. But you know what? I think some of those plans are going to change, and the remote work from home is going to become a much bigger part of our strategy going forward. I think from that flexibility, those are the kind of things that will also help to attract employees to our company as well. So, and with that strategy, of course, from a technology perspective, moving away from desktops to laptops, so that way a little bit more mobile. We were already in the progress of doing that. We're probably going to speed that up as things come back, right? And this part is probably a little bit technical, but certainly the value of setting up internally for us a virtual desktop or VDI infrastructure, so that way we can have an even more seamless experience of our folks transitioning from the office to home to wherever they may be. So those are certainly some big takeaways for us. And as we go through this process, we're going to learn more. We're going to make sure that we adjust. But the big thing that I can leave with everybody, or the big comment that I can leave with everybody, is that protect your staff. They are your number one asset. Even if you are just producing a widget, there's some staff out there that make sure that widget gets done properly, that gets out the door on time. And so your staff are your number one resource, because they certainly are ours. And that's it for me. I'll turn that back to Jeff.
That's great, Cash. Thank you so much. And you know what? We have 6 minutes left, so we're going to try and compress a few questions into that time frame. Please feel free to send in any further questions you might have. I'm speaking to the attendees now. If we don't get to them, then we'll try and circle back to you via email with answers to your questions, if at all possible. And again, thank you for the questions that have come in so far. I'm just scrolling through them here, but might as well start with this one. And I believe it was intended for Dr. Jenny. And what it is was there any speculation on when a vaccine may be available? So get out your crystal ball and see what you can do with that one. Dr. Jenny?
Yeah, great question. Really tough to say. The good news is we do have a number of them already in clinical trials, so that's great news. The early results I've seen have suggested we may know if the first generation vaccines are working, on a small scale by July or August even. A larger scale then is planned with results coming in September, maybe October for that first generation, which could be great news. We could have a vaccine approved by, late October, maybe November. The problem there is that's just the approval. After that, you can imagine how many doses need to be made for distribution around the world. So that these really advanced ones, the ones that are in clinical trials already, a number of them are in the UK, and they're talking about they could have 10 million doses ready by Christmas. But to put that in perspective, 10 million doses wouldn't even cover a quarter of what Canada needed, let alone the UK, the rest of Europe, the United States. So there will be still a lag time from even approval, if they are approved late this year, to being able to get one in Canada. So I don't think we'll see a vaccine much before early summer next year.
Okay, thank you for that. And question for Tony, and it has to do with the family support service that you mentioned. With most large companies, this would be like a third-party type service, and maybe the questioner was thinking of setting up something like that with her company. Could you perhaps speak to that, Tony?
Sure. The ones I mentioned, kind of an EFAP, which are employee in health. We actually use Homewood. So if you want to look up, that's our third-party vendor is Homewood, and they're well positioned in Canada, and they have a lot of kind of large tools to use for your employees. Either they'll have counseling, or you can call in. Homewood is the kind of the baseline for us. But I also mentioned a kind of a smaller one where it talks about Not Myself Today. So if you just Google Not Myself Today, you look in, it's a very low cost organization, and you kind of sign up by number of employees, and it has internal training, digital training to talk about it's okay in your office space to not feel well today. And the one thing I really like about Not Yourself Today has you get all these little buttons that say frustrated, happy, sad, grumpy, whatever. And as your employees get trained, you see these things all over the place, whether they're wearing them or they're on their work desk or on the side of the computer. And it's okay to not feel well today. So again, that's a fairly inexpensive way to kind of reach out to your employees and get some training. So it's Not Yourself Today and Homewood are the two ones we use.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Tony. I do want to mention that in the chat section, you might have noticed already, folks, that I posted some links to government sites that are specifically set up to handle questions related to businesses reopening and best practices and guidelines. So you'll see that I've got one from the federal level, but also several of the provinces as well, and even the city of Toronto. So you might want to copy that if you're interested in getting that more detailed information. And with that said, I think the next question I'd like to steer towards Professor McDonald, and that is, as companies collect self-assessment data, what are the privacy laws or considerations that need to be considered? And is there a retention period for this data? I knew you were going to get the more difficult ones.
Yeah, that's a great question for a lawyer, and I'm not one. So I don't know what I think this is a place where you could talk about the general ethics of data retention, but I think in the first instance here, you're going to have to look at what the relevant, get some good legal advice, because unfortunately, as much as I would like to think that the ethical considerations are the really important ones here, the legal restrictions are going to be the pointy end of the stick, and so I would suggest getting some good advice from a lawyer.
Yeah, for sure. And
sorry to dodge the question.
But obviously you've acknowledged the fact that it's a legitimate concern that everybody should be aware of, and
a good HR department may already have some of that, right? You may have in-house knowledge if you're already gathering various kinds of personal information in the normal course of your business about your employees. So that's a good starting point.
Yep. And it also speaks to the importance of very strong commitment to cybersecurity that every company should be well aware of and forward thinking. I looked at the clock now, and we're at the end of our allotted time. We thank you very, very much to our panelists and to our attendees as well for joining us today. We hope you found it of value. I have to say, the content of the panelists totally exceeded my expectations. We crammed a lot of information into a short period of time. Thank you so much, and stay safe, everybody, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye.